Good afternoon, everyone. Just waiting for a moment to see our numbers plateauing for this webinar. I'm Matt State, Chair of the Department of Psychiatry. Thank you all so much for joining us today for this town hall. I wanted to start by thanking Lisa Fortuna, Christina Mangurian, Alyssa Eppel, Marina Toulouse-Shams, and Adri Jayaratna. Last weekend, I reached out to them to ask for their help, and I'm so grateful for their thoughtfulness and their energy and their determination to make a positive impact on our community. I reached out because I was struggling to figure out what I could do better to ensure that everyone in our department felt safe and valued, and I was struggling to find a path forward for us as an organization in a way that could truly make a difference. In the midst of everything that's going on, the pandemic response, the budget crisis, the demands of their day jobs, and I imagine their own sense of outrage and exhaustion, they stepped up and began to pull together a plan for our department to respond to the events that are unfolding around us, and I could not be more grateful. What I hope for this town hall is that it will be an opportunity for us to talk and to listen to each other, to stand in solidarity with Black members of our community, and to ensure that we continue to be steadfast in our efforts to fight systemic racism, thinking not just about our department and our university, but the constructive role we can play in San Francisco and the Bay Area. Throughout the last several months, as a leader, I have wrestled with what to do and what to say. There's never been a time in my life that I can recall feeling a greater sense of anger, outrage, and hopelessness. And I'm truly disgusted by our national leadership and its indifference, its incompetence, and its cruelty. But part of the motivation for this town hall, and I hope it's a spirit that will drive all our efforts going forward, is an absolute conviction that we can't give in to despair. I have a daughter, Hannah, who just graduated college, and honestly, it breaks my heart that my generation has made so little progress in fixing the brutality, racism, and violence at the hands of police that the Black community and other people of color have faced long since she was born. This feels so acute, but we know this is a problem that has plagued our country for 400 years. But I have not lost hope. In my moments when I'm drawn towards despair, I look at what's happening in the streets right now across the United States. I look at our UCSF community and how it's responded to the pandemic and to the inequities that this has laid bare. And I have hope because of this department and the unbelievable resilience, ingenuity, purpose, and solidarity that you've shown in the face of extraordinarily difficult circumstances. If we're to move forward, we're going to have to be open to having tough conversations. We need to be pressed by those who feel we've not done enough, I've not done enough, to ask how we can do better. Are we actually living up to our commitment to diversity and equity? And if not, how do we take affirmative steps to make sure that we do? As mental health care providers, have we done all that we can to ensure that we're offering care that's culturally competent and truly inviting and welcoming to all members of the community? How can we improve our education and training programs to ensure justice and equity are an integral part, not just of our curriculum, but of the experience of our trainees? How can we better leverage and focus a world-class research department to advance our understanding of racism and health inequities and to make our and others' actions more impactful? And how can we be stronger and more effective advocates for change? Today, I hope we'll embrace these and other difficult questions and conversations and leave with a collective sense of purpose, resolve, and hope that we can and must do better. So I'm going to stop talking now. Don't want to take up more time. I want to hand this off to Christina Mangurian, our Vice Chair for Diversity and Health Equity, who will take us through our program, moderate an outstanding panel, and then lead us in discussion. Christina?
Thanks so much, Matt. And thank you all for attending today. It's really so wonderful to see over 200 people, or close to 200 people in the audience. As Matt said, over the past few weeks, all of us have been dealing with this horrible COVID pandemic. During that time, it had already impacted our work and our lives. And then we started seeing the inequities that the pandemic revealed in terms of, based on race, ethnicity, in terms of who could shelter in place and who was dying from COVID. I think, we know over 1,000 of our fellow Americans have died, but I hope it's clear to everyone that Black Americans are 3 times as likely than all other Americans to die from this virus. And that's just wrong. So that had been happening, and then we witnessed as a nation on social media, the killing of George Floyd and many others over social media. The national protest began, and there was excessive force that was used. We've all been exhausted. To echo what Matt said, Howard Pinderhughes, one of our esteemed members in UCSF on faculty, expressed on Tuesday night that seeing that officer with his knee on George Floyd's neck was a perfect metaphor for 400 years of the African-American experience in the US. So let's just take a minute to be silent, breathe together, and think about the countless innocent lives that have been lost and impacted because of this racism. Okay. I also want to set the frame a little bit for us here during this town hall. Nobody here has all the answers. I don't, neither does our leadership team. And we all have implicit biases ourselves. Matt had mentioned how the institutional and structural racism are really created this situation that we're in. And it's important to recognize that that is not outside of the walls of UCSF. It's right here. It's here at UCSF, and it's here in our department. Thankfully, as a department, we're not starting from zero. We've been doing work in this area, but we also know that what we've done hasn't been enough. So today, we're getting together as a department, one community that is united for change, and to make a formal commitment to address institutional racism in the ways that we can. But to do that well, and at this crucial moment in history, first we have to step back and really listen. We've assembled 5 really amazing Black panelists. What I love about these people, not only are they just wonderful human beings, but they represent who we are as a department, the different types of employees we have, their faculty, their staff, their trainees. They represent our core mission areas, whether it's clinical work, education, span of research and basic clinical and health services, and all in their own ways dedicated to diversity issues. So I'll introduce them each briefly before they speak. So we'll have a time for each of them to speak for a few minutes. If any of you in the audience want to write about any questions for them, you can use the Q&A. You can also do that anonymously. You're welcome to use that if you want to also share your experience, but we're actually building a way to capture people's stories online and on our website as well. So that'll be forthcoming soon. So I'll begin with our first speaker. I'm delighted to get to introduce to you Lisa Fortuna. Many of you know her well. She's our vice chair at ZSFG and my chief of psychiatry there and an associate professor. And I'm really grateful to you, Lisa, for starting us off.
Okay, good afternoon, everybody. So I want to first start off in saying that I'm very grateful to be here at this moment with all of you, UCSF, CSFG, and all that we're trying to do. I also want to underline that although, you know, I'm quite new to leadership at CSFG, at UCSF, I'm not new to facing, like many of you, facing the problems of inequities and maltreatment of people of color, and Black people in particular. And as a woman of color who also has a 15-year-old Black young man as her son, you know, obviously the events of George Floyd and being killed and calling for his mother as he died strikes home. And so I think we know, as we were going through this COVID-19 issues and crisis that we've all been in, you know, there was a webinar that I spoke at where I talked about the importance of leaning in to our culture, to our ancestors, to our heritage, to people who've come before us who've spoken. And as I was preparing and reflecting for this afternoon, you know, I was looking through some poetry, and who I want to call up in terms of ancestors and culture is Audre Lorde. Audre Lorde wrote a poem titled Power, which she wrote in response to rage to the killing of a 10-year-old boy in New York City by a policeman who was acquitted of murder. And this was in the 1970s, when I myself was probably also 10 years old, growing up in Newark, New Jersey. So I'm just going to read an excerpt of her poem, Power. The difference between poetry and rhetoric is being ready to kill yourself instead of your children. I am trapped on a desert of raw gunshot wounds and a dead child, dragging his shattered Black face off the edge of my sleep. Blood from his punctured cheeks and shoulders is the only liquid for miles, and my stomach churns at the imagined taste, while my mouth splits into dry lips without loyalty or reason, thirsting for the wetness of his blood, as it sinks into the whiteness of the desert, where I am lost, without imagery or magic, trying to make power out of hatred and destruction, trying to heal my dying son with kisses. I'm old enough and a mom enough to be in a profoundly grateful place for Audre Lorde and all those other people who've come before us in this struggle. And I'm old enough to be very much in a generative place, where what I want is to really make things better for this generation and for all those children that we need to heal with our kiss. So this is the context by which I commit, and the emotion and power of this commitment, that anything that's short of facing these issues straight on and working together to take action will not be enough. We need to think about this in all things we do. The care and treatment of our patients and community right here at home, in our hospitals, in our clinics. How do we medicate our patients? What do we do with restraints? How are our homeless, including many Black people of color who are homeless and all the underprivileged, how do we treat them with those kisses? The care of our patients and treatment of staff, trainees, faculty, healthcare disparities, including the mental health needs of historically marginalized people at CSFG and UCSF. How do we provide adequate funding and investment for the clinical care, training, and research needed to eliminate health disparities? How do we how do we provide, really sort of declare racism as a #1 priority in addressing the healthcare disparities that we experience in this country and that we see right here at UCSF? And I also invite us to establish ethnically diverse task forces or focused task forces that are representative of all of us, faculty and staff at UCSF. And I know the Latinx task force has restarted at ZSFG. We're inviting other task forces to once again come and unite with us to be able to tackle many of these issues. And I hope that I can call upon all of you to continue to have these challenging conversations, to dig deep into what we are experiencing and feeling, but to forge ahead. And I want to sort of declare right now that that's what I'm committed to do. I'm committed to continue these conversations and to act, and I don't want anyone to hold back from anything less. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lisa. You were the perfect way to start this. The next person that we have up is Michelle Porsche. She's also new to our faculty. She's an adjunct professor of psychiatry and associate director for community outreach for the Schwab Dyslexia and Cognitive Diversity Center.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for being here today. And I also want to acknowledge Breonna Taylor would be 27 today, if not for this murder of her in her own house. And so I want to talk about early childhood memory. Police violence and riots are not new to me. One thing I just really rarely talk about is my experience sitting on my grandmother's porch on 9611 Compton Avenue in Watts when I was 5 years old. It was the house my mother was born in, but she never wanted me to tell my friends when we were living in East LA and then later in Orange County that was where I spent many of my weekends and my summer vacations with my grandparents. So this is maybe a first key point about the devastation of racism, that it's difficult not to internalize. Hard not to see something wrong in us if other people keep giving us the message that there is something wrong. But that summer, like many before and after, I would sit on the front porch with my grandmother. Sometimes my grandfather would join us, and we would watch people coming and going, and we would talk to our neighbors who'd come by and visit. That summer, the first thing we saw that was unusual was that people were coming from what was kind of the shopping center of town, some blocks over, carrying clothes and shoes, bags, appearing wet, expressing what I can only describe through my eyes was liberation. This wasn't like you saw people joyfully walking around, but people were really in good spirits. I'm sure there were also sirens and police in the background. And initially my parents, there was news reports and my parents called to check on me. And they were told things were okay, not to worry. And I don't know how soon it was after that, but once the little corner grocery store was set on fire, my grandmother called my parents to come get me. The fire, the police, the fear, it was terrifying. And I should note that that store on the corner was owned by our Japanese neighbors next door. This family had been taken away during World War II to detention camps. But there was such neighborhood cohesion that people protected their house and kept it in good care for them when they returned. And, this idea of that corner store burning down, I was reminded of it talking to one of the doc students I work with who, pointed out that with the boarding up of stores, even in San Francisco, means it's one less place that he can go and get groceries. Anyway, I remember as my 5-year-old self, the fire, the worry about getting home safely, the worry that my grandparents would be harmed, a very visceral fear because fire is terrifying it was to my grandmother, who was in a wheelchair because of rheumatoid arthritis. So she knew she would be trapped in the house if anything caught on fire there. I don't know how long it took for me to be able to visit again, but it was likely a long time. And sadly, I don't recall ever speaking of that riot, those times with my parents or my grandparents. But these are the types of witnessing of violence that doesn't go away, that likely even unconsciously drive my interest in understanding the impact of trauma on young children. This is really the work of psychiatry. This is our wheelhouse, right? To heal the trauma that children face that they carry into adulthood. My takeaway from that experience was that oppressed people might see a short window of light, but it will be crushed. That police can use excessive force without impunity, and that's been repeated again and again and again. That my life has less value than other people's because Black lives are less. And that lesson repeats and repeats. So that's the struggle. Even when things are going well, when it feels like progress is being made personally or as an institution or even as a country, I never thought we'd see the day when we'd have a Black president or have gay marriage, and those things have happened in my lifetime. And I've also seen that those gains are so fragile. And that makes it hard to thrive under these conditions. I've only been at UCSF a few months, but I already see that it is so much more genuinely committed to diversity, inclusion, equity than any institution I've been at before, and I am very grateful. As someone who's closer to the end of her career than the start, I feel what I most have to offer is generativity to support students, younger scholars early on in their career. And I think this gets back to who are we? After all, we're an academic institution. We teach, we do research. So I just have a suggestion for those who teach. For those who write about their work, please review your syllabus. Are your readings inclusive? Can you improve that? Think about the papers you write. Are you citing Black authors, Latinx authors? Are you raising people's voices? This is the least you can do. It's easy to do. Our students are watching and learning. What lessons are you providing? And finally, we are all in this together. We cannot make gains without all of us working together, and we're going to make mistakes. I'm going to make mistakes, but I believe we can keep going together. So thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Michelle, and we're so what a great thing for us in UCSF having you on our faculty now. So thank you. I believe that Adri is telling me that there's been a lot of comments in there, and so Adri, you should correct me if I'm wrong, but I think we're opening up the chat. Is that correct?
Yeah, we had a request to open up chat so people could talk. So we want people to be able to certainly dialogue with each other on the call. We had closed it just because it can become a little overwhelming for the panelists. So, but we'll open that up now. Just please remember, if you have questions or comments, to use the Q&A function, just so we can make sure we're tracking things and we're being responsive. So thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Okay, let's go to our next panelist speaker. That's going to be Dr. Chris Bartley. He's the Howard Hughes Medical Institute Hannah H. Gray Fellow with an immunopsychiatry clinic at the Department of Psychiatry. He's also an adjunct instructor, recent residency training director graduate, and one of our School of Medicine Watson Fellows. Chris?
Hi, thank you. Never talk about this stuff, so it's a little bit uncomfortable for me. And I think that a lot of what I have to say echoes what Michelle Porsche had to say. So I'm exhausted. This national conversation about race is wearing me out. Personally, I'd much rather be talking about psychopharmacology, or I'd rather be in the lab studying autoantibodies. That's where I feel most comfortable. And I bet that almost everybody listening to this is exhausted too. So when I was asked to do this, I really appreciated Dr. Mangurian reaching out, and I also really wanted to say no. And as I thought through why I might say yes, I recalled an eye-opening experience I had shortly after college. So I played club rugby in college, and like most of my peers, I engaged in derogatory banter about women. A female friend of mine repeatedly told me how inappropriate the jokes were, and these were just jokes, I thought. This stuff doesn't really happen. It's not really my problem. Then she told me her history of sexual assault. It was a one-off, I thought, but it really bothered me. And so I started asking women in my own life whether they had ever been the victim of physical or sexual violence. So I was pained and honestly embarrassed to find that nearly a quarter of the women that I asked had been victims. Women in my own family. The problem wasn't remote or abstract, it was all around me. I just failed to notice it. So no amount of data could have made me aware of the fact of female physical vulnerability. No amount of data could have made it more tangible and real to me than their personal stories. So I've been accused of intellectualizing problems. And so as I reflected on that eye-opening experience, I thought perhaps I should tell my story rather than the facts and the numbers. So here it is, or at least 5 minutes of it. So I grew up in Colorado and entered an all-white private middle school after passing an aptitude test. On my first day, a kid who would later become my best friend greeted me with a joke. "Nice to meet you, Chris. Did you know that I have Black people in my family tree?" "Yep, they're still hanging there." Years later, after we had made amends, he took me golfing for the first time and he lent me clubs. Before I could tee off on the first hole, the club manager came running out, screaming at me, and called me a thug for wearing a backwards hat. We were all wearing backwards hats. He accused me of having stolen the clubs that I was playing with. Later in high school, after learning to drive, I was pulled over more times than I can count. Each time I would be accused of stealing the car and was forced to provide a movie ticket or some other proof of my whereabouts. This happened in our home as well. Police had come over and demanded that we produce identification proving that we own the home. So I worried about being stopped by the cops before George Floyd or Eric Garner. I worried about being shot in my own home before Breonna Taylor. I worried about looking suspicious or going for a jog in my own neighborhood before Trayvon Martin or Ahmaud Arbery. I was worried because I almost became one of them. During college, while on a road trip, I was in New Orleans in a bar with friends. I was in a bad mood and decided to walk back to my hotel alone without having had a drink. It was before smartphone navigation and I got lost and I really had to pee. I found a corner in an empty, darkened alley, but soon I was nearly hit by an all-black vehicle. 2 white men jumped out in plain clothes and they yelled, "Boy, what the F do you think you're doing?" Scared and confused, I ran. I was followed by them for about 2 blocks, only to throw myself up against the wall after hearing, "You better stop, we're cops." One officer pinned my head against the brick wall, while the other put on a black leather glove and punched me in the face. In handcuffs, I was questioned in the back of the car as they drove around. "What were you doing?" "I really had to pee, sir." "Where are you from?" "Coming from Connecticut, sir." "What's your business?" "I'm on spring break, sir." "Which college?" "Yale, sir." "Oh, so you think you're smarter than us?" It was at that moment that I knew that it was time to be silent. They continued to drive around for 30 minutes discussing what to do with me. "You know, boy, we have a spot where we could take you right now and end your life. No one would ever know. That might teach you a lesson." "Take it easy," the other cop said. "He's just a college kid." There was a moment of silence. And then the first one said, "Yeah, but he does think he's smarter than us." Yep, it's a good point, the other officer said. Let's book him. So I spent 2 days in jail. When I presented to the judge, I was asked how I wanted to plead to public intoxication and resisting arrest. My college buddy had clerked with Elliot Spitzer the summer before and told me to speak to the prosecutor prior to pleading. I told the prosecutor my story, and after staring at me blankly for 10 seconds or so, he said, "I'm so sorry, this happens all the time." He turned to the judge and he dropped the charges. So in spite of everything I've told you, I do think that things are improving. If you go to Wikipedia and you look up the Kingsley Plantation, you'll see Esther Bartley, a slave ancestor of mine. She was born 40 years before the Civil War, and she died in 1931 at the age of 108, 6 years after my grandfather was born. My grandfather fought in World War II, but he returned home to Jim Crow and redlining. He was again a second-class citizen. My father, who was not yet 65, integrated his elementary school in the 4th grade under armed guard. Needless to say, the treatment was horrific after the guards left. In 2013, after Trayvon Martin was murdered, the response to the hashtag Black Lives Matter was All Lives Matter. Today, only 7 years later, around the world, we see that the response to Black Lives Matter is Black Lives Matter. So I think that as we look across the arc of history, we see that things are improving. In this department, I've always felt safe, valued, and supported. I've even had some of my attendings stick up for me in racially charged situations. We're all starting to realize that the unequal treatment of Blacks under the law isn't an abstract problem. It's all around us. But even though I'm exhausted, I'm hopeful. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chris. I know you wanted to say no. I imagined you would, and I'm grateful you said yes. The next speaker is Marquita Maiz. She's a clinical social worker with the UCSF CSFG Child Trauma Research Program in Embrace. She was also awarded the 2015 Chancellor's Award for MLK MLK Leadership, and is a leader in the School of Medicine's Differences Matter initiative. Marquita?
Hello, everyone. I'll follow also, like Chris, that I contemplated saying no, but Christina caught me at a good time. Unknowingly, she caught me exactly at 8:31 on Tuesday morning, right after I had to log off of a Zoom call because I was in a sea of white faces where everyone wanted to check in and process about what had happened over the weekend. And I collectively counted 9 white faces, white colleagues in positions of authority, in positions of power, who are executive directors, who are managers, who are supervisors, all saying, "I don't know what to do." And a rage started building up inside of me. And I was afraid of what was going to come out of my mouth. And so I had to let them know, I need to log off. And I've been in a state of needing to log off ever since then, and I'm trying to find my way back in. So Christina, you sent that email, and I said, okay, you'll be ready by Friday. So first, I want to honor my ancestors and my elders whose shoulders I stand on. Thank you for being with me every day. Thank you for the forever whisper that lives in my ear, to never forget and to never stop. Happy 27th birthday, Breonna Taylor. While you are not here in the flesh, your spirit is soaring a movement. Thank you, soar high, beautiful queen. Also, thank you to the spirit of George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, and Tony McDade. We are carrying the torch, and we know that you are with us. I didn't write new words for this. I decided to go back to words that I read back in 2016 when I was asked to talk at the Department of Psychiatry's annual diversity celebration. And the title of what I read then was, "To the Field of Psychology, What is Our Pledge to Injustice?" I'm sad to say that the words that I read then apply now, and I didn't need to come up with new words. So I'm going to read to you what I read then. This was on the Hills right after Philando Castile was murdered, in front of his child, in front of his fiance, on live. For the past 2.5 weeks, my body has taken quite the journey, an emotional sensory-based journey. I have to say that in 2020, on this day, my body is still deeply embedded in an emotional sensory-based journey. This journey starts off with a numbness that I can't shake. And initially, the numbness doesn't allow me to watch the videos of the murders that we see, the executions that we see. I say no, I say I can't. I'm full and I'm done. Because once you've seen one, you've seen them all. And I don't want to take in anymore. I am tired. I am exhausted. So sometimes I avoid, I repress, I ignore, and I redirect attention and focus into other things, trivial day-to-day concerns, wake up, go to work, come home, etc. I attempt to partake in the privilege of ignorance, the privilege of being oblivious, but there is no escaping it because I wake up every day next to my husband who is Black. Everywhere I turn, all forms of media does not allow you to dismiss this. So you have to cave in and you end up watching the videos and you end up experiencing the squirming in your body, trying to reject the horror that you watch. And you try not to shout out the words, execution, 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 because clearly we are being executed. The feeling of rage constantly rising in my body is sickening. I quickly try to pick up avoidance. I quickly try to pick up repressing. I quickly try to pick up redirecting when this happens. It's a skill set I sometimes negotiate because mastering what I see the rest of the professional world doing. I'll call this skill set business as usual. The negotiation usually includes an internal dialogue of thoughts and questions. Being conscious about these things, they hurt too much, and I have to protect myself. I have to survive. I'm not sure if conscious is supposed to be a tool of survival. Maybe it's the antithesis of survival. So sometimes I go back to numbness, but it never can last long because before I can close my eyes long enough, it is happening again. This time, back in 2016, there was a 4-year-old little girl whose voice was heard saying, "Mommy, it's gonna be okay, I'm right here," as her father, Philando Castile, was slumped over in the front seat dying from 4 bullets the officer put in his body. In 2020, it is George Floyd's daughter being interviewed on live TV, wanting the world to know that she misses her daddy. It is that child who is showing up to the protest and seeing the movement and saying, "Daddy changed the world." It is always at the sound of a child's voice where my numbness disintegrates. It hits me that this is the child that I have been trained to do treatment with. Being trained in child-parent psychotherapy, a dyadic model that treats children from birth to 5 and their caregivers who experience trauma, I am the one who helped them create a story about what they go through. Our children are experiencing trauma that is forever etched in their brains, in their memories, and in their bodies. Our children are witnessing the murders of their fathers, of their aunties, of their cousins, of their uncles. It shatters us. It breaks us. And I don't know if you know what the feeling of brokenness feels like inside of your body, but it feels scary. Often a sound emerges from me that I don't know exactly where it comes from. It's a cry that is internal and that is depth. And it's a cry that feels like it's my ancestors calling because they know what this feeling was like. They had this sound too emerge from their bodies. It is a timeless cry, and we have yet to escape this cry because it still lives in us. And it's upon these surreal cultural collective experiences where I've been amazed at how historical trauma lives in our body and the true power of intergenerational transmission. Often overwhelmed, I'm often walking around in a daze, feeling hopeless and feeling helpless, but knowing that I can't sit too comfortably with those things in my body. I equally become scared of their weight too. Oftentimes, I hear my grandfather, and he has said, "Marquita, everyone can't make it out of the jungle." And while I struggle with that, and the many other words that he has shared with me, including racism is alive and well and is not going anywhere, I have committed my wake up, my survive, and my sleep cycle to alleviating the conditions of the jungle while simultaneously fighting every day to not be sucked into that dark hole. Because granddaddy also tells me to raise hell, and my granddaddy also tells me to pray. In order to do this, I have to access my greatest motivator. And for me, that is anger. My anger is righteous. My anger is justified. Black anger has been the target of so many projections. It is often perceived to be scary, and yet it's hard to mitify a justified feeling that we need to express. My anger, it fuels me to be courageous. My anger fuels me to no longer accept excuses. My anger fuels the inability to hear, I don't know what to do. My anger fuels the demand for accountability. But how does one aspire for accountability in this country when America is racism? Racism was the machine that built this country. All of its morals, all of its values, all of its traditions, its systems, and its infrastructures. Nothing about this country has escaped the smog of racism. So I have to tell you, when I heard back in 2016, let's make America great again, I got nervous and genuinely worried, because again implies repetition, one more time, and or the return of something. It is 2020, and what the fuck? It has returned. It is here again, and it hasn't gone away. We are impending another election, and the handwriting is still on the wall. W.E.B. Du Bois foreshadowed the problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line. And one thing that I've learned about trauma is that it will keep rearing its ugly little head if it's not dealt with. I'm a social worker by training, and I often have to ask myself in the Department of Psychiatry, in the field of psychology, when it comes to the conversation around Black Lives Matter, when it comes to the conversation about police brutality and routine state violence, where are we? How about the terror of ICE raids and the lack of inclusive and safe spaces for the LGBTQ and the generalizing and stereotyping of those belonging to certain religious faiths? Are these matters of concern that we should have a voice for? To endure injustice is to engage in psychological warfare, is it not? So where does the field and where do our departments take action against injustice? An action that requires us to get out of our offices and from behind closed doors. An action that requires us to use our power as intellectuals, researchers, and practitioners. An action that involves us taking a risk in order to seek change. And most important, an action that causes discomfort to become the expected and normative feeling when dismantling oppression. Back then, I questioned, does a liberation social psychology framework have a place in our department? Can this framework be used to help our clients, help the people that we're supposed to serve, empower themselves? How do we engage in a learning, researching, and practicing forms of treatment that seeks to transform our clients into self-conscious agents of their own mental and political liberation? Maybe we can do more than just alleviate symptoms, medicate and change and manage behaviors. Maybe we can begin to provide intentional and explicit forms of healing that help people carve their own paths to socio-political consciousness. This can't be done for us. This is something that we want to do for ourselves. I'll end with another thought in addition to what I said back then. The concept of reparations has been tossed around for years in our country, and yet, when it comes to the descendants of enslaved Africans, we have yet to rise to the occasion. I think that this is so much bigger than our government, and it can start on smaller grounds. I'm asking our Department of Psychiatry, what would it be like if we took up the notion of reparations for Black and African Americans? How can we be intentional and innovative to rightfully honor the dues that my ancestors have already paid for? The fact that we create programs, we create interventions, and then we have to hit the ground running trying to find funding for them is a little insane to me. The money is already there. When will the money be relinquished? When will the power be relinquished so that we can do the healing that we know that we need to do, that we are capable of doing for our people on our own? rightfully and financially funded. What I commit to do while I am here at UCSF is to advocate for Black spaces. I do think that we need our own spaces where we can do our own healing. I do think that we need our own funding where we can make the power moves that we feel like we need to make without there being overhead or oversight about how to do them and sort of what the outcomes need to be. And that is what I commit to doing and pushing our department to continue to show up for. Thank you.
Marquita, thank you so much. I'm glad that I was able to catch you at that moment. I continue to feel like you're an important voice in our department, and I want you to, I emailed you about this earlier because I knew what we were going to be talking about. I want you to hold me accountable with this, and let's just continue to have more conversations, okay? The next speaker is going to be Marilyn Thomas. She's a first-year postdoc in my lab, and she's a social epidemiologist focusing on structural racism and also works at SF Build. And then I think we'll then switch to hearing from our leaders after her about what we're going to be doing for our community, what actions we're going to be taking.
Thank you, Christina, and good afternoon, everyone. First of all, I just want to thank all of the panelists for being a part of this. And I initially was excited about going last because I had intended to say a few things, but I think everyone has articulated my feelings so incredibly poignantly that I'm going to be brief. I didn't write remarks. I have notes because I wanted this experience to be visceral because it is for all of us. And I wanted to share that I'm biracial, but I'm Black. My father's Black, my mother's white, but I am Black. That's how I identify, and that's how others identify me, no matter what community I live in. And I was born and raised in Bayview, the Bayview district of San Francisco. If you don't know, Bayview is the most socially isolated, underserved Black community in San Francisco. And even that's changing because of gentrification. And I'm the only daughter of 6 brothers. And growing up in Bayview clearly was difficult. But what I wanted to share is how did I end up at UCSF as an epidemiologist coming from Bayview, right? And when I went to high school, my mom got a job in Millbrae. And back then, Millbrae was a predominantly white community, middle class, upper class. And so she used her work address to be our home address so that I could attend that school on paper. It's back when you could do that. And I remember on my first day there, I came home and I said, Mom, everybody's hair is yellow. I had never seen really blonde hair before. That is how homogeneously white that community was. And when I went back home to the city and we commuted, that was my first experience of how race is deterministic of opportunities and access to things. And this white community in Millbrae, they had shopping malls and grocery stores, and there were farmers markets, and the kids went to vacation in Europe during this summer, and everybody just had stuff. And then I go back into my community, I'm like, why is it that everyone who looks like me is living like this? And then I go to that community and they're all living like that. It was my first introduction to racial disparity, racial despair, really. And then it occurred to me while I'm watching all my high school friends prepare for college and take SATs that myself and everyone in my Bayview community are so busy being Black that it never even occurred to me that higher education or a professional career was even something I could consider. And so I attribute my ascent into academia to that experience, being exposed to a privileged environment, equity, equality, is what changed my opportunity and my perspective. And there were so many other things I wanted to share, but I just feel I need to be brief. My experience here at UCSF in the Department of Psychiatry as a postdoc has been a very good experience for me. And that's mostly because my journey through academia, as challenging as it was, I surrounded myself and was fortunate enough to have mentors, women of color in the sciences, in positions of power, professors at San Francisco State University who were Latina and Black and understood what I was experiencing in those spaces, being Black, just being Black and white spaces. And especially in science, I was oftentimes not only the only woman in the room, but the only Black person there too. And so I've had support that's then connected me with other networks of strong women of science and women of color in science. And so I've gotten a lot of support, and that's partly why I'm here. And that doesn't happen for all of us, right? Like, talent is evenly distributed, but opportunity is not. And so to speak to what Lisa said earlier, my focus in my career as a social epidemiologist, it's been challenging. It's been very challenging to get people in power to acknowledge structural racism as a public health issue, and even more so, police killings as a public health crisis. And so now that we kind of see these kind of worlds merging and everyone's starting to see what we've been calling attention to for generations, really, I am feeling very honored and grateful to be able to have this space, to be able to have a voice and to share our views, not just how we feel, but what we need to move forward, what we're looking for. And I share, Marquita and Chris, in your hesitation to participate. And I shared this before, that I was hesitant because it's oftentimes things like this happen. And then leaders will call the Black people, they'll call the Black employees. Can you come sit on a panel? Can you share your experience so that we can figure out what to do? And I'm not saying that I'm not grateful for this space. We need this space. But if what's important is to take what we're saying and what we're sharing and turn it into action. And when I say that, I mean, as a social epidemiologist studying the health effects of structural racism, needless to say, I have some very strong opinions about structural racism and the necessary efforts to eliminate it. But that includes a critique of the status quo and how we engage in our incredibly difficult discussions around it. And I just hope that you all can recognize as leaders that we recognize that the Department of Psychiatry and UCSF broadly are champions against racism. But my goal in this space is meant to push us all to recognize that we all need to be constantly and critically reflecting about whether and to what extent our actions are actually meeting the intended goals. And not only that, if we're going to be pushing policies to improve equity, policies to try and eliminate structural racism in the system, that also means that we need policies to address existing disparities. It can't just be pathways to eliminate what might be coming. It's here, it's embedded within our systems already. So how are we going to address what's going on now? So I want to thank you all again for having this space, and more importantly, being able to listen to the other panelists' powerful reflections. Thank you for sharing.
And thank you so much, Marilyn, and all the speakers. I completely agree. Everybody was just so powerful, and I had such a range of emotions during this, ranging from like disgust and shock at hurt and hopeful, but a lot of actual physical, like just feeling nauseated, you know, I think it's important first step, but as you said, I think a real reason why I wanted to hold this was to have people to hear and listen, but then also to be very action driven. Because I think one of the things that I wanted the audience to hear was actually that we need to have action, and we need to have action by our leaders and accountability by our leaders. So I'm going to turn to some of our leaders right now. I'm going to ask them to talk about work that they're doing to be anti-racist as individuals or in their institutional roles. And I'd also like the audience to take time to ask questions and answers if you want, or write in the comments any ways in which you're trying to work as individuals or in your sphere of power to be anti-racist, because as Marilyn was saying, it requires all of us, and it requires constant vigilance. I'm also going to be noting the time. We are going over by half an hour so that we can continue to have this discussion. I apologize if some of you are not able to be here for the entire discussion. It will be videotaped, and we will be disseminating this afterwards. Okay, so the first person I'm going to turn to on our leadership team is John McQuaid. He is a vice chair at VA Medical Center and chief of psychiatry there, and professor of psychiatry.
Thank you, Christina, and thank you. The power of what each of you has said and shared as panelists has been incredibly moving and driving massive emotions. And I related to much, and particularly Marquita's rage at leaders not having an answer and asking for answers. And I've heard that from my staff, and I have, one of my goals is to apologize for not having been there for my staff in a way that I need to be, and not addressing racism, not creating the anti-racist space that we need to be making. And that's what we're working on here for us at the San Francisco VA for our folks. What we've been doing, I'm going to keep this, I know the time, so I'm going to try to be just, we've been working to create space for both all staff together. There was actually another meeting occurring simultaneously with this for our staff, unfortunate that they were conflicting. And also space for our staff of color, and particularly our Black staff, to make sure that there is space for them to come together and speak and determine what's going to be most helpful for them. And we are working with each of these meetings to shape a effort to have sustained change. One of the things that I related to was the sense of exhaustion the panelists spoke to, that in being asked to do this work, and how do we not be exhausting people, but uplifting and supporting people and moving forward in a way that is manageable and active and makes change, meaningful change. Because the fears I hear from my staff have been, well, we're going to start and then we're going to stop again, like it's always happened. This is not going to go. As Marilyn you spoke to, this will we'll get going. We care, and then other things will come up. The news cycle will change. How do we not let that happen? Or we're going to keep running at this pace, and we're all going to burn out. And we're all going to be unable to do anything meaningful. So that's our goal. Build a pace, keep this going. And we are working to try to create that structure. And we're trying to, and we in leadership are reaching out to our staff and our Black staff and trying to say, you don't have to be carrying this on your own. We need to be carrying this, and we need to be there for you, not asking you for guidance other than if you want to give it, but asking you to know that we're here for you and here with you. And we want to be standing there for you and taking the lead and doing what we need to do. that's the structure and the culture we're trying to build and be. And I don't know if I'm happy to take questions about what we're doing, but I'm just grateful for being here and grateful for what everybody shared.
I'm really grateful for your leadership, John, and being a tremendous ally. You always have been, and you will continue to be. I'm going to turn now to Marina Tulushims. She's our Deputy Vice Chair for Research and Director of the Infant, Child, and Adolescent Program at ZSFG, and is a professor here.
Hello, everyone. I want to start by first acknowledging that I'm a highly privileged white passing minority. I am an Iranian woman immigrant, and I am very clear that I have lived my life benefiting from being able to 100% pass in white spaces and move through my entire life taking advantage of white privilege in the US. And as a result, I've also internalized white ways of thinking and being, and I'm constantly challenging myself to identify those ways and actions, own them, and name them out loud to others. And I'm raising this because I know that there are other people in my position in the department as well. And I feel like the onus is on me as a highly privileged minority and as a leader in this department to listen and to listen and to listen and amplify voices of Black and brown faculty, staff, and trainees who are abused by structural racism and actively dismissed or disregarded, disparaged. The onus is on me to actively fight, particularly in those white privileged spaces, against pervasive, insidious racism, injustice, inequity, intolerance, and brutality, all the things that you have heard in this panel, and to promote anti-racism and trauma healing. And I feel like the onus is on me, not only at our department community level, but also at the larger San Francisco and Bay Area community level. I have felt that there has been always and continues to be a critical need for our department and the university as a whole to address racism as a public health issue, like has already been brought up. But we must engage with the community on declaring racism as a public health issue. And we must be declaring racism's toll on the mental health of San Francisco Black and brown and other historically marginalized communities. I believe that this San Francisco and larger Bay Area community outreach and engagement is deeply tied to being able to dismantle institutional racism in our own department. We must no longer relegate community outreach and advocacy on dismantling racism through only small specific research projects or small clinical programs that have managed to get funding. We've heard themes of this already this morning. For example, only programs or efforts with faculty, staff, and trainees who are at San Francisco General Hospital. And the department, I can tell you to this end, is committed to working on a concerted, coordinated, and ongoing departmental effort led by myself and Adri Jaratni, our department chief of staff, to have a UCSF Department of Psychiatry community and engagement and advocacy working group or task force, whatever we want to call it, but to build community outreach and advocacy efforts across sites to address dismantling racism and structural inequities, particularly with respect to mental health needs and among our communities of color, and near and dear to our heart that you've heard also about our youth, our children, youth, and our families are suffering. I want to also note that Marquita brought up about 2016, and I want to acknowledge and note that in 2016, Marquita and I co-led a town hall for our division of infant, child, and adolescent psychiatry directly after the Philando Castile murder. And I want to acknowledge and own that that sustainability has not been here. And I personally want to recommit to the sustainability, and I know the department wants to put in and has committed to putting in the supports. We don't know what it's going to look like yet. We don't have all the answers yet, but I know in discussions there has been commitment to having this be sustainable and ongoing. No more of this, like we did this town hall in 2016 and now here it is. We cannot dismantle by that. But in order to do that, we have to have some coordinated cross-site as a department. What are we going to do around this? And so some of the examples of the work starting in this area include the Latinx Center of Excellence and DOP Latinx Task Force exploring events to partner with Black churches, with Lisa Fortuna and the Latinx Center of Excellence partnering in some ways around this. Other ideas have been to develop UCSF Department of Psychiatry events that explicitly invite in and partner with community-based organizations and other community mental health providers on addressing structural racism and healthcare disparities and inequities. So these are just some of the ways that I wanted to share about me and from the leadership perspective for you to hear that piece, but also what the department is working toward being committed to in this area.
Thank you so much, Marina, for that and for your leadership here. And I want to take a time before I turn to Alyssa Pell. I'm going to list out many more of the things that our department is going to do at the end and pledges that I have as an individual and as my leadership role. But I want to just let some folks know some of the things that I'm also doing as a person, little things. And changes that I'm hoping might be things that others can think about as well, because it's both addressing the structural issues as well as some stuff that we do ourselves. Something that Dr. Maja Jackson-Trish, who's one of our vice chairs, had been talking to me about was about how people don't ask often our Black patients about police brutality. And I actually don't do that routinely in my interviews with them. And yet, I was part of a council that was working on, writing about police brutality and the mental health impacts of this. So I'm committing to kind of, as I work with my Black patients, to find out more about specifically about the police brutality and their experience. I always talk to my kids about racism. That's part of what we do, but I'm talking to them about it more and as age appropriate as I'm able to, taking them to the peaceful protests that I feel safe in taking them to. But I do think that work around the dining room table and with our families is important. I'm going to turn now to Alyssa Appel, and then we're going to open it up to the audience. So Alyssa is our vice chair for adult psychology and professor in our department.
Thank you, Christina. Thank you so much to all of our speakers. This has been a very emotional, intense hour. And now that we're going to 1:30, I know this is funny to say, but I'm missable. If you need a quick break, take it, because when I'm done, we're opening it up to discussion. And we really want to have dialogue here. So get up and stretch and do what you need to. I'll keep it quick. I'm humbled to say something here to all of you, and part of me didn't want to, because I have white fragility, this discomfort of talking about race, seeing racial inequities, and being part of this oppressive system. And so what it is very hard to see something we are so deeply immersed in. White supremacy is the context, it is the foundation, the bedrock of every institution that we live in, including academia, research, medicine. So we all have, this has been named here, but I just want to say it. This is all of our work. We burden our Black and brown colleagues to do the work, to educate us. And it's got to end. So the dialogue, the work now going forward of listening very carefully and dialoguing around solutions is all of us. This is not a special interest group. We need to see the invisible oppression that we have been part of and realize that we are active agents in research and medicine, and we can cause unintentional harm when we don't work hard to see the injustice and how we are contributing to it. So we know how to become experts in anything. Overnight, we all became experts in working at home, in turning our lifestyle upside down for shelter in place, for learning about a virus. And so we have links in our mailbox, and it's a little bit overwhelming all at once, but there are ways for us to see the work we need to do together. It's a dialogue, and it's not going to happen instantly. But that is our next step in our department, is to create the forum for this ongoing discussion, starting with listening in small groups. We hope each and every one of you will be part of one of these small groups that we are developing with Christina in leadership, that is going to be basically asking the question, how can we become an actively anti-racist department and institution? I will start with my own lab and Center for Health and Community. And fortunately, I have people like Samantha Schilf in the chat line who are far ahead of me in the development of this awareness and the solutions. I love the ideas that came up already, Marquita, of reparations. What we do in our department will be followed. We are a leader. People are watching. So I will end there, and I'd like to just say it's now a priority that we all become experts, and we don't, we feel that discomfort and acknowledge it and step in. And we are not just allies because we want to be and it's moral. We are here because we are humans, and we feel the suffering of our colleagues, the trauma, the systemic oppression. It's ours too. So I'd like to turn to our first person in the audience, and I've asked one of our postdocs to speak, Lauren Whitehurst. Lauren is one of our few postdocs who is an African American. She is a phenomenal leader in basic science of sleep and the new field that she's developing of sleep equity. She is leaving us this month as she joins a faculty job at University of Kentucky, but she is here with us today. Thank you, Lauren.
Thank you, Alyssa. Can everyone hear me? I hope so. So my name is Lauren Whitehurst. Thank you so much for the introduction, Alyssa. And I'm an experimental psychologist and a cognitive neuroscientist here in the department at UCSF. And I want to first just recognize the lives that have been lost for us to be having this conversation today. I know we know some of the names, Breonna Taylor, Tony McDade, George Floyd, David McAtee, but we don't know so many more. And I recognize their deaths are directly connected to my life and my existence. I know a lot of you can't see me, but I am a Black woman. I am married to a Black partner. I'm a sister, and I'm an aunt to Black children. I'm lucky to be the daughter to both of my parents, my mother and my father. I'm also privileged to be a granddaughter to Charlotte, a single Black mother who raised 3 children in Virginia during the brutality of the Jim Crow South. My parents attended segregated schools and received care from segregated hospitals. My family has long resisted violent racism and systems that work to minimize their humanity, and they have all been my guide to resistance. I bring these people and these realities with me every day and also into our conversations today. I've been grappling with what it means to be Black and a scientist my entire career. Growing up in a Black community, I was taught to be very wary of science and medicine, as it was introduced to me as something that exploited Black lives and took advantage of Black oppression. And it is true that science, just like racialized policing in the US, has directly contributed to many of the inequities present in the world today. And I want to be clear that I don't have the answers on how to fix racism in academia or science. None of us do. The racist systems that support the US and its institutions were created by white supremacy through Black enslavement, exclusion, oppression, and death. Recognizing that is important to knowing that it is not the responsibility of Black folks to fix these issues, which a lot of you have talked about today. Also, none of us, myself included, are immune from the influence of white supremacy and the influence it can have on our work, as we are all embedded in a racialized society. However, as a member of the scientific community and of the UCSF community, and someone who is in the very beginning of my career as a professor, in a time when consciousness around Black life and Black death is so high, I have been thinking about what it means to create and envision anti-racist spaces, especially for trainees. In this really hard time, it has been easy to succumb to the rage and pain, to be exhausted by days working and nights protesting. But I have found a lot of joy in imagining this, and I wanted to share just a few of my thoughts with you all. So what has become clear to me is that there is no blueprint for this, no manual we can look to create anti-racist cultures in our departments and labs. I am not sure if it would be better off if that manual existed, as I think true equity requires a constant effort that is emergent and grows as we grow. What is also clear to me is that senior PIs, mentors, and leadership have a larger burden to carry in this work. The hierarchical structures that are medicine and academia, in which junior trainees are apprenticed to senior mentors who have the access to resources, capital, and thereby power, can be harmful for a multitude of reasons. But as it exists currently, it likely acts with particular harm to Black trainees. In my own personal experience, majority of the senior scientists in cognitive neuroscience were mostly white and mostly men. As we know, this demographic makeup is not unique only to my area, but common across most areas of science and medicine. As an undergrad and a graduate student, I was encouraged to reach out to these senior mentors. Like many trainees, I was told that expressing my smart ideas would get me in the door with these very busy people who hold the power. This is so common in academia. I'm sure we have all had this experience. However, like many other Black people who grew up in the racist society that is the US, by the time I began seeking out academic relationships in college, I already had countless experiences with racism. I had already learned that I needed to actively protect my mind and my body in public spaces defined by whiteness to survive. Now, to succeed, I was told to reach out to build connections with the people who directly represented my history with racial abuse. The emotional labor that places on a young trainee, a young Black trainee, is hard to express, but I know many have lived this experience. I played my role. I reached out and made connections. To come into the humble successes I've had to date, I thought I had to. I have had positive experiences in doing this, I will say. But yes, I also experienced explicit racism, stereotyping, and tokenism in my training, many times unbeknownst to the person engaging in the harm. It has made scientific spaces difficult for me, and even speaking today right now is difficult. But similar to why I protest police brutality, I feel that I no longer have a choice to be quiet. I do believe we can do better. Hiring and retaining Black faculty is critical, but it would be irresponsible to suggest that is all that is needed. The system as it stands requires those that have the least power to do much of the emotional labor. Yet switching some of this burden to senior people is possible. Senior PIs, especially white and non-Black PIs, must do the work to educate themselves on anti-racist practices and work alongside department leadership to integrate anti-racist values into their science and medical training. Normalizing and not exceptionalizing these training efforts is critical to changing culture. Senior white and non-Black PIs should also make their commitment to anti-racist training and lab environments clear on their personal and academic websites. This will signal to future trainees you have a commitment to their lives. There's a responsibility for senior folks to make that signal clear. This is a small step in shifting the burden of the emotional labor to those with power. It is now a PI's responsibility with department accountability to ensure Black trainees can expect safety when working alongside you. This also provides for increased accountability when considering promotions and tenure. When you commit to making Black lives safe, you also show that you value every life. These efforts are a small start. Once you recruit and retain Black faculty and trainees, it is then important to reaffirm your commitments, be vigilant in supporting their community with each other and their advancement. This conversation is a start. I would like to end by saying that feeling pain, rage, overwhelmed, frustrated, and sadness is expected right now. I feel all of that too. I encourage you, however, to funnel that energy into beginning your anti-racist education and action today. I think it's important to recognize that we are all capable of doing harm. We are all subject to the white supremacist system that is the society we live in. However, increasing our consciousness around these issues will allow us to recognize harm and do it less. we can all just start there. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak. I really appreciate everything that's been said and the amazing panelists that have been here talking with us today. And I'm looking forward to being in conversation with all of you about these things.
Thank you so much, Lauren. When I'd heard from Alyssa that you were leaving, I was disappointed. I'm happy for you, but disappointed because you're so brilliant, and you shared so many wise words with us just now. And I know that we only have about 10 more minutes. I think I wanted to directly address some of the questions that have come up so far, and then open it, please, folks, if you want to ask another question, please write in the question and answer, and Nick can unmute you. Many people were talking about police and questions around what we're going to do there. And actually, Lisa, Mark, and I have already been talking about examining, as Lisa mentioned, having some of the difficult conversations that are needed and partnering with the Sheriff's Office to look at ZSFG as a starting point, what use of force looks like and is like, the disparities that may be there, that are likely there in our house at ZSFG. This will take time and effort, but I know that Lisa is committed to it, and so are all the leaders of those units in ZSFG. Do others have questions or would like to chat? If not, I know it's hard in this setting. Maybe what I can, I'll leave us a moment.
Christina, there was one question we got around, I think you answered the questions around policing, both at ZSFG. There was another question around policing general in regards to mental health crisis intervention. I don't know if you or anybody else on the panel wanted to.
Yeah, I mean, I imagine, Marina, I don't want to speak for you, but I imagine part of our community outreach is not only with community community groups, which is consistent with what's happening across our university, right? It's important that the work that we're doing in our department aligns very closely, which was what's happening UCSF wide. But I think there is a special dialogue that we have a unique voice to make in terms of the mental health impacts of police brutality towards our community here in San Francisco. And so that's would be part of that ongoing work. Other questions, Adri, that you have?
Mark Leary raised his hand, so I don't know if Nicholas,
Mark,
if you could unmute Mark.
And then I'll end I'll end in 5 minutes and for the last 5 minutes.
Hi, Christina, can you hear me?
I can.
Oh, wonderful. I just wanted to follow up on the question about the sheriff's role here at CSFG. I think it is critical to look at that, but I think even before we address the sheriff's issue, we have to look at ourselves and the role that we play in when we ask the sheriff to intervene. I think that's, if we can look at ourselves and look at the decisions that we make and the way that we engage our patients, I think that the sheriff issue will be much more easy to deal with.
And if I can just add, I mean, I just want to underline that, working with Mark and everyone else here at CSFG, when I was saying, we're looking at these issues, right, in terms of, what we can do with the police and the sheriff, and how we, how our patients are treated on our inpatient unit, when Citywide is working with them on the streets in terms of their homeless population who needs services and to be taken care of. But I would just want to underline that it starts with us, and that's really the framework that I'm going to be operating on is, how do we address our own implicit biases and assumptions and fears, that we're going to have to look at all those things very directly and openly and courageously about what's our role in how people are treated, who gets restrained, who gets what medications, Who do we hurry up and call the sheriff for, right? I mean, all of those things, we have to be courageous to look at those. And that's what my invitation is that we need to look very deeply and courageously.
I agree.
And may I also briefly add a point about police?
Yeah, then I want to, perfect, please do.
So I know we're talking about this in the context of police on campus at San Francisco, at Zuckerberg, and also at the 7th floor and monitoring the patients. But I also want to add that it's important to talk and partner with the Sheriff's Department and police on how they're assessing and using excessive force on patients outside. And so what tends to happen, there's a literature on how officers are more likely to arrest or assault Black civilians who are showing signs of mental illness. They're 3 times more likely to arrest them or harm them or use force on them than their white counterparts showing the exact same behavior. And so what happens is you have Black, particularly men, going to jails with people with severe mental illness, going to jails and not getting the health care they need disproportionately. And so I think that's also something important to do, is to partner with the police department to perhaps guide them, provide them some type of information, or, guide them on what they should be looking for, so they're not disproportionately targeting people of color with excessive force outside of the hospital.
Yeah, outstanding comment, Marilyn, as usual. I think what this is telling me, look, we've run over by half an hour, and there's much more to talk about. And so, as I mentioned in the beginning, my wish is for this to be a continued discussion. So I want to just clarify some of the commitments that we as a department are making and that I'm making in my leadership role regarding this. So Lisa also already very clearly outlined kind of her way of very strongly and, with a lot of effort in digging deep with this at ZSFG. At the VA, John has also talked about the work that he's doing there to listen to what the employees need, knowing that there's so much room to grow. Marina's talked about the community outreach that's going to be done and the advocacy group that'll be started. Alyssa's talked about the resilient small groups. Descartes, who's our vice chair for education, is working closely with Peter Uresti and Kiati Brombat on the diversity committee to make sure all faculty attend the DEI training that we have at the university. 50% of our faculty have done so. It should be 100%. We can achieve this. Child psychiatry, I know that I've been working with Brian King and Matt State, and I worked on a grant to help diversify our child mental health psychiatry workforce, bringing in more people of color. That's important. Now, for me, I'll speak about me. What am I going to do? What can you hold me accountable for? You can hold me accountable for conducting a listening tour in our department. I've done this for a listening tour for women, gathering women's wisdom across the Department of Psychiatry last year. I will do this I had done that for women faculty because there's so few African-American faculty. I plan on doing this for with our Black faculty, Black trainees, and Black staff at all 3 of the sites. I also plan on disseminating more resources to people on how to be good allies. This, as we've talked about before, is not new, as it's made clear by our extraordinary panelists and other people who've spoken up. Not new for the Black community. It may feel new for some others in our community, but this is not new. So how to be an ally, what are steps that you can take? I will be working with the chair's office on a listening forum, not just around diversity, but for all aspects of our mission, so that we can hear about what's needed from the bottom up. I'll continue to be doing work with the Office of Diversity and Outreach and align efforts so that we can really be as strong as possible with our department and with university efforts. And I think the most important commitment that I want to make is I commit to working with Matt and the rest of the leadership team on making an action plan that has specific deliverables and a timeline that address considering things like Marquita raised about reparations, that includes things that people have raised on the chat about funding, All the people that serve on my diversity committee, I don't pay any of them. They're all doing this for free. There's a lot of people on my committee. I invite many of you to join me. A lot of them happen to be Black and brown or women. That's very typical of diversity committees. But we need to think about what we're doing. We need to think about how to bake this into the work that we do every day as individuals and in this academic environment, so we can build the better future that we all want. This is going to require all of us an ongoing vigilance. I think, Talmadge King just raised a few days ago, he's our dean, for those of you who don't know, he raised, the famous Martin Luther King Jr. Quote, "The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice." And what Talmadge said is, he said something that he's a very wise man. He said, it bends because of the work our community and our people do. If we're going to be part of this, it's work that each of us are going to do. We can't do it alone. We need to do it together. So I'm grateful you came today. I'm grateful that you listened. We'll meet again soon. We will have another event like this. I don't know when, but we will have one. And I want each of you to think about what you want to do to make things different. So thank you for being here today, and have a good weekend.